Hello, and welcome to A Flat Pack History of Sweden, the podcast that chronologically takes you through Swedish history from when the first people arrived here right up until the modern day. I'm Elsa.
And I am Chris, and after 2 episodes on law and order in Sweden during the High Middle Ages, it's now time to return to the royal and political action that's going on in the 1200s. But before we get to that, we need to talk about a strange Swedish phrase. And so this one is gå åt skogen.
Yeah, go to the forest. That is a strange one when you translate it to English.
So what does it mean apart from giving someone an order?
Yeah, I mean, you could say it if you just want someone to go to a forest or go to the forest, but it's more often used to describe something. So something went to the forest and it meant that it went badly.
So it's like a swear phrase.
Yeah.
Without being swearing.
Yeah, I mean, let's say that you're in school and you had a school project and it didn't go well, you got a terrible mark on it, then you could say that your project gick åt skogen. It went to the forest.
But is it usually just because of like a mistake, like if your PowerPoint presentation broke? Or is it just you did it badly? Can it be both?
I think it can be both. It's just a generic phrase to describe something that didn't go well. You can also use it in a sort of speculative future sense. Det här kommer gå åt skogen. This will go to the forest. This is not going to go well.
Yeah, well, hopefully this episode won't go to the forest, and it's one I've been looking forward to for quite a while. When you do sort of like the long-term planning for what you're going to be reaching in 5, 6, 7 episodes' time, this was one that I was looking forward to.
Yeah, well, of course you would, because we're back on your sort of favorite topics, kings and royal drama, political drama, which there was a lot of in the 1200s.
Yes, and so where were we up to last time? Because we've had a bit of a gap looking at the law and order side of things since the last chronological episode, which was back in episode 34, which we called Kings and Jarls Play Jenga. And we saw a bit of a breakdown in the established system of having a king from the Erik dynasty being followed by a king from the Sverker dynasty. Now, the system eventually fixed itself, but that wasn't without Sverker II trying to break it.
No, because Sverker II tried to appoint his 1-year-old son, Johan, as Jarl, as his wife was part of the Bjelbo dynasty, and they saw Johan as the perfect mix of these two families. Unfortunately for the couple, the Erik dynasty didn't stand for this power grab, and after 3 separate battles over 5 years, Sverker ends up dead, and Erik X becomes king. The Bjelbo family retains the jarldom after Johan is removed from the role, with first Knut, then Folke, and then Karl the Death serving as jarls. Erik X dies of natural causes, a pleasure not bestowed on too many kings of the time. He hadn't been king for that long either. He died in 1216, a few months before his only son, another Erik, is born. So, supported by the Bjelbo family, the former baby Jarl Johan returns to become the Sverker dynasty's last king. The most memorable thing in his reign is a voyage east to Estonia, where he manages to subdue a few locals before heading home. Unfortunately for Sweden, almost all of the men he left behind, including Karl the Death and the Bishop of Linköping, who was another Bjelbo family member, they are killed in an attack on the Swedish castle over there.
Yeah, which isn't very good in any shape or form. And it doesn't really get any better for Sweden at the time because Johan soon dies unmarried and with no children. So the Sverker dynasty, as we said, is officially off the map, at least in the male side of things. And that's where we left up last time. So let's look at what happens next.
Yeah, so after Karl the Death was killed in Estonia, His son, Ulf Fose, is made Jarl by Johan. He takes over in 1220. So Ulf is 2 years into the job when it becomes his turn to manage a royal transition. That's because Johan dies, and so Ulf Fose invites Erik to Sweden to take the throne as Erik the 11th. After all, they have to stick with this informal rotating system. So the previously exiled Erik, son of Erik X, returns to Sweden and is proclaimed king. But just like Johan, he is crowned when he is young. Very young, it starts to get a bit silly. Erik is only 6 years old in 1222 when he is crowned king.
Yeah, that's pretty young for any job, I think, on the planet. And if there had been a few lingering doubts before, it's now absolutely crystal clear that it's the Bjelbu family in charge, because Erik is king and has 2 slightly older sisters, but no other living relative. Even though he's only 6 years old, what had Erik been up to in his 6 years in exile? Because remember, as he was born after his father had died, he didn't really have any time as being seen as the official heir to the throne in Sweden. And that's because as soon as Erik X died, baby Erik and his mother Rikissa pack up their things and move to Denmark. And that's moving back to Denmark for Rikissa, because she is the sister of the ruling Danish king Valdemar II, and they're both children of the previous king Valdemar I of Denmark.
Yeah, so essentially when her husband dies, what Rikissa does is take her kids and return home to Denmark. We mentioned last time that Valdemar, along with the Pope, originally tried to stop the Swedes from crowning Johan as king, but eventually they accepted that the Sverker dynasty was back in control for a while. In terms of a childhood, we can only imagine that Erik had quite a good upbringing, living at the royal court in Denmark for his first couple of years. Seeing as his mother was also Danish, he probably learned to speak Danish. Oh no.
Yeah, bad for a future Swedish king.
Crazy times. But it wasn't all fun and games for young Erik, because when he was just 4 years old, his mother dies as well. She didn't live to see her son become king, which happened, like we said, just 2 years later.
And there isn't anything official about this because, like a lot of this recent Swedish history, there's not too many sources, but we can assume that Valdemar looked after Erik for the next 2 years. And then we're now back up to date because it's then 1222 and Erik is recalled to Sweden, if we can call it that, by the Bjelbu family, since the Sverker dynasty has died out and baby Erik is the only member of the Erik dynasty left standing. With no rivals in the country, and naturally with the support of now Jarl Ulf Fasa, the 6-year-old Erik was hailed as king sometime between August 1222 and July of the following year, 1223. And the Archbishop of Sweden supported his cause to be king and appears to have crowned him in Strängnäs Cathedral on 31st of July 1223. So he maybe had a couple of months being the unofficial king, but then was officially crowned in July 1223. Now, of course, a 6-year-old, or maybe by then just about 7-year-old king, isn't going to be the best king. So a regency council was formed to rule the country until the king could become of age and take control himself. In this council were Bengt, the Bishop of Skara, who we briefly mentioned last time around, and he was also named the Chancellor. And in addition to this Bengt, there were a number of powerful locals, one Norwegian cousin of Erik, and another man called Knut the Tall.
This Knut the Tall is supposedly a distant relative of Erik. If you remember all the way back to Erik the Holy, who is the founder of this Erik dynasty, he had 2 sons, one who went on to become Knut the First, but then also another one called Philip. This Philip maybe had a son who in turn might have been the father of Knut the Tall, so he would have been a distant cousin of Erik's. But this branch of the family can't have been that important before, if he was indeed a relative, as he's never in contention in the power plays of previous episodes and only appears at this moment in the story. He is mentioned in a source as being a member of the Regency Council and being a relative of Erik. That is all we have. Indeed, some historians think he might not even have been a member of the Erik dynasty at all. Anyway, these members of the council appeared in a contemporary document from about 1225 as acting on behalf of the minor king. They called themselves in this document his conciliari, or in Swedish rådsherre. Now, if we translate that back to English, rådsherre actually translates as advice knight.
Which is very cool. Knight being the guy on a horse with a shield, not day and night.
No, I'd quite like to be a rådsherre. I'm the advice knight. Anyway, this is the first time that the title chancellor appears in Sweden. But in modern terms, maybe it's easier to think of this role as prime minister or speaker of the house in a kind of sort of way, even though we're far from a democracy.
Yes, and when looking at the other members of the council, plus Ulf Vasa, who is still a jarl, it's actually Bengt, Bishop of Skara, who seems to hold the most power. He has been bishop at Skara since about 1219 and became chancellor as part of this regency council. He's sometimes known as Bengt the Younger, for those people looking further into the sources, as there was a previous bishop of Skara also called Bengt back in the 1100s, because, they don't like to invent new names, just reuse the most popular ones. And this Bengt actually appears first in historical documents as one of the kingdom's leading men and a supporter of King Johan back at his coronation in 1219, which we saw in episode 34. He was one of the church figures given privileges by Johan, ensuring he could collect more church taxes and things like that we mentioned at the time. In the years after the coronation of Erik, Bishop Bengt appears as one of the real rulers in the kingdom alongside Jarl Ulf Vasa, hence his title as Chancellor. He's also the only bishop among the King's Regency Council, so it seems like Bengt was quite a harsh upholder of church orders and rules, and this was probably inspired by a trip to Rome where he saw the Pope just before Johan died, getting some papal inspiration to uphold these Christian laws in Sweden. And his entry in the Västgötalagen says that he was harsh and fierce towards both priests and lay people.
Ooh, sounds intense. One other thing was happening in the church at this time, and very confusingly, it involves another bishop called Bengt.
Oh no, is there an Ingegerd involved at all, perhaps?
No, thankfully not. This second Bishop Bengt is the Bishop of Linköping, and he's part of the Bjelbo family, so he's a cousin of Jarl Ulf Vasa. Perhaps we should just call him Bishop Bjelbo for today, as there is now a bishop called Bengt in both Skara and Linköping. We can call the one in Linköping Bishop Bjelbo.
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. What does this Bishop Bjelbo get up to?
Well, first he starts off expanding some of his church authority. Now, the Bishop of Linköping is actually the one with ecclesiastical authority over the island of Gotland. Keen followers of Swedish history and lovers of Swedish geography will have recognized that we have effectively avoided talking about Gotland and Öland so far in the podcast. Don't worry, we will do a whole episode on the history of Sweden's two biggest islands very soon to catch us all up on what's been going on there. But for now, this will have to do. We read a fascinating book, or rather the first part of a fascinating book, of the history of Visby Cathedral. Visby being the main town on the island of Gotland. So let's give a shout out to Gunnar Svanström for his book Visby Cathedral, or Visby Domkyrka in Swedish.
Yes, the book is in Swedish in case you want to go and read this book. This is when the building of Visby Cathedral gets its first mention in the history books, but not perhaps as you might expect. So, as we mentioned, the churches on Gotland belonged to the Bishop of Linköping, and had done since the beginning of the 1100s. According to an agreement made up at the time, every 3 years the Bishop of Linköping would visit Gotland's churches and consecrate new churches and some altars. Now, at this point, just like Stockholm, Gotland was home to a large community of German traders. At some point before the 1220s, not really sure when, these German traders in Visby had set up their own little parish church, and this was Church of St. Mary, and in 1225 Bishop Bjelbu writes a letter inaugurating and consecrating the church as part of his domain. But interestingly enough, because it was built primarily and mainly to serve the German traders and not the local people, the church didn't receive its own parish area of responsibility or sort of area of land to look after. Part of Bishop Bjelbu's letter is him trying to manage the tricky relationship between this new German church and the other churches who are already been established in the area serving the local Swedish people. Presumably the existing churches didn't want to lose any of their land from their parishes to give to the German traders, and so there had to be some sort of negotiation about the land.
Yeah, this is very interesting indeed. It's sort of an example of local politics in the 1200s. Another example of the Germans getting involved in local life in Sweden at this point, just like how we saw them getting involved in life in Stockholm. Now, this small German church won't become a cathedral for a couple of more centuries, but it is sort of off to a fun start as an official place of worship in the Swedish ecclesiastical system. One building that is going to become a cathedral, however, is Bishop Bjelbu's home church back in Linköping. This is because in 1230, if we skip ahead for a brief moment, he starts a major building project. He took the initiative to expand a church in Linköping to become a cathedral. You might think that that's not a too complicated task, but let's read out a description of this job from the cathedral's own website. Work on the cathedral was started in 1230, with the main building works being completed in 1520. Linköping Cathedral is the most impressive and expensive Swedish church building of the Middle Ages.
That's quite amazing, really. Work started in 1230 and finished in 1520, so it only took 290 years to build. It's like the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, but in medieval Sweden.
Yeah.
I guess Bishop Bjelbu wasn't around to see it being finished then.
No, he certainly wasn't. He hadn't lived for nearly 300 years.
Do you think they dug up his body and put his skeleton in sort of like a little chair so he could watch the final stone being put in place?
Gosh, I hope they didn't. But he would have been proud because, as the cathedral's website says, it was Sweden's first Gothic building project. So we're finally catching up with some European counterparts. For example, Sens Cathedral in France was the first cathedral to be built in the Gothic architectural style, starting 95 years earlier in 1135. So Sweden is a bit behind on this architectural style. But anyway, this was a major building project, but it was also happening at a point of great drama in the political world. So to explain, let's jump back just a few years to 1226. That is because, despite a steady start, and unlike the foundations of the cathedral in Linköping, the Regency Council started to have its own wobbles in the mid-1220s.
Yes, it's definitely wobbling because in 1225 the Norwegian king attacks Värmland in the west of Sweden. Norway is actually still in the middle of its 110-year civil war era that we've mentioned recently, and a lot of minor nobles and pretenders to the Norwegian throne roam around Scandinavia each time they're exiled from Norway. And at this time, one of them happens to be living in Sweden and has a little bit of support from the locals there. So the Norwegian king doesn't stand for this and actually comes into Sweden to try and deal with them. Luckily for Sweden, this ends quite swiftly, but it also affects the Regency Council, as the next year in 1226, Erik's Norwegian cousin leaves Sweden to try and claim the Norwegian throne. To cut a very long story extremely short, as we aren't a history of Norway, this cousin doesn't become King of Norway, but also doesn't return to Sweden, because he becomes a relatively powerful figure in Norway for the next 35 years or so. We won't mention him because it just makes things a bit more confusing. But oddly enough, Norwegian politics seemed to be the talk of the town, or at least the talk of the church in the 1220s. That is because the current Norwegian king was known to be an illegitimate son of a previous king. Just like King Erik, the king was born after his father died, and so there was a lot of controversy around his birth because his mother only shows up with him as a young child a few years later. So it's all a bit dramatic.
Yeah, and so who does the Pope turn to? Because, of course, the Pope needs to get involved. Well, he turns to Bishop Bengt, the Chancellor of Sweden. And Bengt, along with the Archbishop down in Lund, were given the job of investigating the circumstances surrounding the birth of the Norwegian king. Like they're some sort of religious private detectives, I don't know.
Pope Squad.
However, they never got to finish this mission, as by 1229, the Pope has to reassign the mission to two Norwegian bishops because both the Archbishop of Lund and Bishop Bengt had died.
Oh dear. That's one way to not finish your job, is to die beforehand.
True. Exactly when Bishop Bengt died, nobody knows, but most historians date it to 1228 or 1229.
Yeah, so not only does the Pope need to find a new private detective, but Sweden has lost their first ever Chancellor. And perhaps because of a fight over who would become the next Chancellor, but we don't really know for sure, fighting erupts the next year between the Regency Council and those loyal to the King. So it didn't last very long, this peaceful Regency Council. And so King Erik is 13 at this point, and he suddenly sees Knut the Tall unite with a disparate group of nobles called the Folkungs, and they start a brief but brutal civil war.
Before we continue, we should just quickly explain something about the Folkungs, because it's a bit confusing. Like Chris said, they seem to have been a group of disparate nobles who were trying to combat the increasing power of the church and the state, and seem to have been based in Uppland. They were a bit grumpy and annoyed and wanted to return to the days where the kings of Sweden were elected properly by the local chieftains and petty kings in areas like Svealand, Uppland, Västergötland, and they saw that the power of the king, and especially the power of the jarl, was increasing, and that it was in fact the Bjelbo family who were more or less choosing the kings. They also didn't like the fact that power was now increasingly sort of centered in Västergötland and other more southerly parts of the kingdom, and they fought for Uppland to regain more power and influence.
For those reading ahead or reading extra, it's not just confusing in itself, but what is more confusing is that later historians, starting in around the 1600s, began using the Folkungs to refer not just to this group of upset nobles, but also using this name for the Bjelbo family. And so in earlier history books, the Bjelbos are sometimes referred to as the Folkungs, but to call them Folkungs has no real merit because they certainly didn't call themselves that. We're not really sure why this weird naming practice began, other than that historians maybe thought the name Folkung sounded quite cool, and so wanted to apply that to the no doubt cool and powerful Bjelbu family, just ruining the history books for everyone.
Yeah, and modern day historians have stopped doing this since it's confusing and inaccurate, but you can still come across it in history books. Also, something that adds to the confusion, there was another noble family in the 1200s whose name was actually Folkung. But anyway, just to clear it up for now, when we say Folkungs, we mean this group of noble families who were unhappy with the way things were going and nothing else.
Yes, we're sticking to the Bjelbu family being the Bjelbu family.
Yes.
And it's because of the increasing power of the Bjelbu family, the power concentrating itself in Västergötland, that builds up this resentment from the Folkungs towards the current system. And this resentment's been building for quite a while now. And they see the Regency Council and a very young king as the perfect opportunity for them to try and force Sweden back to the ways of the past.
And so war it is. On the 29th of November in either 1229 or 1230, there is a battle at a place called Ulustra. Although sources and historians argue, like always, if this was a real place or not. As for the result of the battle, well, Erik is defeated and retreats back to Denmark, where his uncle Valdemar is still ruling. We don't really have more information than that. We just know that the young king is forced to flee, and Knut the Tall becomes king with the name Knut II of Sweden, put in place there by the Folkungs. Interestingly, Ulf Vasa remains Jarl, so perhaps the Folkungs didn't achieve everything they wanted to in the war, as the Bjelbo family still have a very powerful position in the kingdom. But still, Erik is gone.
And we have another exiled ex-king to look after.
I mean, Scandinavia in the 1200s must have just been littered with exiled kings. Everywhere you turned, there would have been an exiled king.
Knut the Tall seems to have jumped right into being king because he starts off making a few changes to the laws of the land. And from now on, the king was required to review the laws of Sweden every third year, and those collecting money for debts weren't allowed to enter the house of the person who owed the money unless someone from the courts or the government, if we can call it that, was there with them.
Well, that sounds very 21st century, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of like a check on personal revenge by sort of a tax collector type chap following you around, making sure you didn't nick someone's cow when all you were only supposed to be taking was his goat or something.
Yeah, that's a good rule.
In the meantime, Knut has two adult or very nearly adult sons who are possibly helping him out running the country too. But we'll return to at least one of them much later on in the timeline because that's it. Knut dies.
What?
Yep. That's it. He is dead. A few years after becoming king, he dies in 1234. Sources are a bit contradictory about the exact circumstances, but sooner or later, Erik returns from exile in Denmark and is crowned king for a second time.
Oh.
The Annals of Lund say that Erik returned to Sweden before Knut died and was trying to claim the throne when Knut the Tall dies. But the Erik Chronicle says that Erik returned to Sweden after Knut's death and a little bit of fighting as well. So, the exact circumstances are shrouded and lost to history, unfortunately. But either way, Knut is dead and Erik is back in business for a second term, if we can call it that. The fact that Erik returns implies that the Folkungs didn't really have enough time or political power to force through enough changes and drag Sweden back to the time where the different regions and areas of the country had a stake in electing the king. The return of Erik is seen by modern historians as an example of the Björbo family once again taking back control of the royal system in Sweden, or keeping hold of it throughout the reign of Knut the Tall.
So Erik is back, and crucially, this time he is now just about 18, so no need for a regency council for his second reign, so that's good timing. There was still some drama though, so don't worry. Dr. Hans Gillingstam, a legendary Swedish historian and long-term editor of the Swedish Biographical Dictionary, which is an excellent source that's part of the National Archives, he believes that there was a lot of tension between Erik and his Jarl, Ulf Fase, because after all, Ulf Fase had remained Jarl whilst Knut was king, so how loyal really is he? Ulf Fase was, like any natural Bjälbo family member, quite pragmatic, it seems, in his approach. Erik and his supporters believed that Ulf Fase should have fought harder against Knut, against the Folkung faction in court, and backed Erik's cause while he was in exile, instead of being so stubbornly pragmatic. However, the very fact that Erik was able to return and the Folkungs had not been able to reinstate a fully elective system implies that the Bjälbo family managed to retain a certain amount of control over the political system.
Yeah, because after all, it was them who decided they should bring back Erik.
Yeah, whatever the reason for their anger at Ulf Fase, Erik's supporters were to be disappointed, as Ulf Fase had spent a long time, by now around 15 years, as Jarl, and had clearly learned a lot from his family's history about how to stay in power. A young king from a nearly extinct dynasty certainly did not have the political power to remove him, so they would just have to get along. The fact that the Folkungs couldn't remove Ulf Fase either, or get their reforms through, shows you the extent of his power as well.
Yeah, he seems to be learning from the best of the Bjälbo family. And surprisingly, after a bit of a rocky start, Erik and Ulf seemed to get on for quite a while. They also patched things up with the King of Norway, which helped keep some stability in the northwestern part of the kingdom too. Erik's uncle, Valdemar, is still King of Denmark until 1241, and he's then succeeded by his son, who of course is therefore Erik's cousin, so there's still quite a close connection there too. And it's quite clear that Erik relied heavily on the Bjälbo family to keep control of the country. Whilst the Folkungs are no longer in power, there doesn't seem to be a big massacre of their supporters or any reprisals taken against them. They seem to have grudgingly accepted the return of Erik and slunk away back into the shadows, at least for the moment. In the meantime, the Bjälbo family's grip on power is only strengthened later in the 1230s, when King Erik's older sister Ingeborg marries a man called Börje Magnusson, another cousin of the Jarl Ulf Fase. According to the Erik Chronicle, there was quite a battle to marry Ingeborg, so the Bjälbo family must have been quite happy to get another strong connection to the king's family.
Whilst it was probably a relatively big deal back in the day, if you think back to, say, when Prince Harry got married, this has gone down as a much bigger event in history in hindsight. That is because we see the first appearance of this new member of the Bjälbo family, Birger.
This Birger is born in around 1208 or 1210, we'll say around 1208, judging by what we mentioned back in episode 34. That is because this Birger is son of Magnus Minnesköld, who we proposed was killed in battle in 1208, but some historians say 1210. This makes Birger the brother of recently deceased Bishop Bjälbo and their other brother who was previously the Bishop of Linköping. Birger is, as we mentioned, the cousin of current Jarl Ulf Fase, which makes him a nephew of Ulf Fase's father and previous Jarl Karl the Deaf. and also nephew of the other Birger Brusa, who died 6 or so years before this new Birger Magnusson was born. Now, historians believe that Birger Magnusson was named after this uncle Birger Brusa because Birger Brusa was such a powerful member of the family and had a long time as Jarl, and someone that clearly the whole family looked up to. And that's the thing with the Bjelbo family. Just being born into it makes you a powerful person by default, as you'll have so many powerful family members alongside you and in positions of power. It's the fact that his cousin is the Jarl, though, that makes this new marriage particularly important to both the Bjelbo family and the king. Having Birger married to the king's older sister can only bring more influence to the Bjelbo family.
Like most newly married political couples of the era, they have one goal in particular right from the start, and that is producing some heirs. Birger and Ingeborg get going on this right away, and by the time this episode ends, 6 children will have been born. We won't mention any of them yet, as they only start to do important things in the storyline in the next episode or so we don't want to make it more complicated than necessary. The next couple of years start ticking by in Sweden, and the country seems to be focused on consolidating itself rather than anything more dramatic. The Folkungs are still seemingly content with things, and Erik is growing into his role as a bit of a puppet king for the Bjelbo family. And so what does Sweden tend to do when things are a bit stable at home? Well, we go east, of course.
Yes, Sweden has been expanding its influence to the east for quite a while now, and we'll return to this in more detail in a few future episodes, especially in an episode all about this early period of Swedish involvement in Finland. But all we need to know for now is that it starts with a new expedition. And this expedition supposedly led to the establishment of a permanent fortress called Tavastaborg in southwestern Finland and the formal Christianization of the region. This Swedish expedition was sanctioned by Pope Gregorius IX, who wanted to make sure that the fairly newly Christianized areas around the eastern shores of the Bay of Bothnia stayed Christian, because they've been swaying this way and that when it came to Christianity a bit recently. And so that's why the Swedish intervention is even sometimes called a crusade in the history books, although certainly in the modern day it's quite debatable whether that's the right term or not.
Either way, modern historians suggest that Birger Magnusson was either leading the expedition or was one of the commanders. There has been some confusion as to when this expedition or campaign in Finland took place. Earlier historians said it wasn't until 1248-49, but that makes no sense when we factor in other events, especially events in Birger Magnusson's life. Instead, it is much more likely that it took place 10 years earlier, 1238 to 1239, which is also what most historians today seem to agree on.
So, let's take 1239, and Birger Magnusson and the rest of the Swedish expedition is busy in modern-day Finland. But they don't just stop there. They want to go even further east and attack the pesky Novgorod Republic, which they do in 1240. Actually, the Novgorod Republic is an important reason why the Swedes headed over across the sea in the first place, because they want to try and stop Novgorod's influence in the area, or at least try and limit it. The Swedes are sending this expedition to try and go up the Neva River, which goes from the Gulf of Finland in the Baltic Sea all the way into Lake Ladoga, and the river actually goes right through modern-day St. Petersburg, in fact. According to the Novgorod Chronicle, which is still around 100 years away from being written, by the way, so keep that in mind when we judge its reliability, The Swedish force landed where the river Izora met the river Neva. Now, the Novgorod Republic, knowing that controlling the Neva River effectively gave them full control over this amazing trade route all the way down to Constantinople that we've heard so much about, naturally didn't just sit around and let the Swedes start taking control of this important area. The Prince of Novgorod, called Alexander, led a small army out to attack the Swedish invaders. This Alexander actually goes down as a legendary figure in both Rus and modern Russian history, and he starts off young. He's only 19 at the time of this battle, but he's actually been Prince of Novgorod since he was 15.
15? Wow, that beats what I was doing at 15. But it only gets better. Alexander beats the Swedes, and the Battle of the Neva saved Novgorod from a full-scale invasion from the west. Because of this battle, 19-year-old Alexander gained the nickname Nevsky, which means of Neva. Shall we see what the Novgorod Chronicle has to say about this event?
So it says, "The Swedes came with their prince, with their bishops, and halted in the Neva at the mouth of the Izora, wishing to take possession of Lake Ladoga, or in one word, of Novgorod and of the whole Novgorod province," which isn't one word, by the way, Novgorod Chronicle. But again, "the most kind and merciful God, lover of men, preserved and protected us from the foreigners, since they laboured in vain without the command of God. For the news came to Novgorod that the Swedes were going towards Ladoga and Kainax. Alexander, with the men of Novgorod and of Ladoga, did not delay at all. He went against them and defeated them by the power of Saint Sophia and the prayers of our sovereign lady, the Holy Mother of God and eternally Virgin Mary, on the 15th day of July." So it's actually almost the anniversary, but let's continue. "There was a great slaughter of Swedes. Their leader, by name of Spiridon, was killed, and some thought that their bishop was also killed there. And when they had loaded 2 ships with the bodies of high-born men, they let them sail to the sea, but the others that were unnumbered they cast to a pit that they buried, and many others were wounded, and that same night they fled, without waiting for the Monday light, with shame."
Wow, dramatic as always when you read the Novgorod Chronicle. Now, there is no mention of this expedition in any Swedish sources, sadly. There's also no mention in Swedish sources of a bishop dying at this point, but again, maybe the Swedes kept quiet because they lost and, you don't want to record a loss, whereas the people of Novgorod won and obviously wanted to write poetically about it. As we'll see, Birger Magnusson will become a very influential figure, and maybe he wanted to remove traces of this not very successful campaign early on in his career from the records when he became more powerful himself.
Yeah, it's certainly plausible. And we should also just quickly mention this Spiridon that the Chronicle mentions as the leader of the Swedes. Modern historians have no idea who this is or who it might refer to, or even if it's a real person. Maybe it was an odd Novgorod title for something. Nobody knows. It's another one of those mysteries of history, unfortunately.
Yeah, so that's what happened in the east. On the home front, it is King Erik's turn to get married next. Perhaps he didn't want to be left out of both the marriage game and of the Bielbo family. So in 1243 or 1244, he marries Katarina, daughter of Jarl Folke, who was another cousin of Birger Magnusson, albeit one who died right around the time Birger was born. Most importantly, though, this Katarina's mother was a woman called Helena, who's the daughter of Sverker II. So Erik has married into the Bielbo family on his wife's father's side, and to the now extinct Sverker dynasty on Katarina's mother's side.
Yeah, and that's quite a powerful alliance right there, or at least pedigree. And the kids from this relationship would be able to claim almost ultimate descendants to almost every Swedish monarch, all the way back to Stenshield 200 years earlier.
But
But there will be no children from this marriage. Perhaps that's a good thing, like, genetically speaking. Otherwise, you could imagine getting quite inbred at this point.
yeah, really quite inbred. Some sources do say that the couple maybe had a few baby daughters who died in infancy, which would be very sad. But there are no children who survive into adulthood. We have one more major political event to cover today. But before we go into that, a small piece of trivia, or perhaps background for you. We know that Ulf has been Jarl for around 25 years by the time of Erik's marriage. He had an extremely strong position in the country, with his cousin Birger seemingly working as his fixer, or at least military man to send on these expeditions abroad. Ulf also had some other form of political or economic control. He was able to mint coins in his own name. Yes, normally something reserved just for the king, several coins survive today that bear his symbol on them.
Yeah, and that's really quite impressive power for a non-king. And this power over the kingdom is going to be tested one final time, and that's in 1247, when the Folkungs are back once again. They're like whack-a-moles. They just appear like Folkung, 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 and get bashed on the head. And they're going to get bashed on the head again. We mentioned earlier that King Knut the Tall had two sons who seemed to be helping him run the country during the short period he was in charge of Sweden between Erik's two spells as king. Well, one of these sons is named Holmgar, and he leads this Folkung rebellion in the north of the country, where the Folkungs had retreated and still had a bit of influence, and they raise an army of peasants to march on Erik. Sources are unclear on Ulfasa's role at this point and what exactly the chain of events was. Some people suggest Ulfasa joined the rebellion, which sounds like an amazingly stupid decision for someone with effectively all the power in the kingdom, whereas other people say he might have already died by the time the forces come to blow, and a third group of people suggest he was alive at the battle but dies shortly afterwards. We're not really sure which one of these it is, but it would seem very weird for him to take part in the rebellion against the king he was effectively the puppet master over, and he doesn't agree with the Folkung's political goals either.
Indeed, so most likely he either died just before or soon after. Either way, who does Erik put in charge of his forces against the Folkungs? Well, of course, it's Birger Magnusson, a veteran of the expeditions to Finland and Novgorod. The battle took place at Sparsätra, which is located in Uppland, the Folkungs' heartland. So it is north of the modern-day town of Enköping. According to tradition, it was fought on waterlogged meadows west of the church of Sparsätra, which actually sounds quite fun to fight on a waterlogged meadow, but probably not. What definitely doesn't sound fun is the way the battle went for the Folkungs. Their peasant army seems like it had little hope of winning. Birger Magnusson had clearly learnt from big historical battles in Scandinavia, such as those fought during the Danish Civil War, because he had heavy cavalry for the first time in Swedish history. This is the first time it was used in a battle in Sweden.
You might imagine that this would have been quite a surprise and somewhat overwhelming for the peasants from Uppland, and you would be right, because the battle was a crushing victory for Birger and King Erik. The fact that it was such a crushing victory and that they were peasants going up against the king's forces imply that it might have actually been the king and Börje sort of proactively going after the Folkungs rather than the Folkungs rising in rebellion. After the battle, the pretender to the throne, Holmgar, he survived and fled north, even further up in Uppland. But it wasn't long before he was arrested by men loyal to the king and was beheaded.
Ugh.
Yep, dead. And the other major leaders of the rebellion, potentially all farsa, if we want to believe that story, were either killed in the battle or also executed shortly afterwards. Interestingly, when it comes to Holmgar, the Erik chronicles say that King Erik walked with Holmgar's body to the grave at his funeral, with some archaeologists and historians like Henrik and Fredrik Lindström suggesting that this ritual meant that the old Norse way of honouring dead enemies was still being practiced in Sweden at this point. Holmgar might have been on the wrong side of the battle, but he was still an honourable foe.
So what is the fallout from this battle and the year 1247 in general in Sweden? Well, it is a big year and a bit of a monumental change in the country is about to happen. Because regardless of if he fought alongside Holmgar and was executed afterwards, or if he just died before or after the battle, Ulf Fase is dead. That means that by the time we transition into 1248, King Erik needs a new Jarl. And there's really only one person to turn to, Birger Magnusson. This new job means Birger gets the name change that he becomes famous for. From now on, he will be known as Birger Jarl, to separate him from his uncle Birger Brosa, who was also a Jarl. We will dedicate the next episode, and in fact probably the next couple of episodes actually, to Birger Magnusson and his life and all the important things that happen in the second half of the 1200s.
Yeah, it can, like when I first read about him, I thought his last name was Jarl. And
Every Swedish school child in history has thought that because that's how it's written out. But he is Birger, who is a Jarl.
Yeah, it should be like Birger, Jarl. Yeah. But yes, and because a bit like Clark Kent in Superman, Birger Magnusson changes identities, and it is this new man, Birger Jarl, who appears in all the sources. Oh, obviously, he doesn't change identity, but the role that he gets and the amount of influence he has in the kingdom changes, and only for the better. Birger Jarl, which is how he's known down in history, is perhaps the most known and recognisable figure in Swedish history until we reach the 1500s, really. It's sort of like Richard the Lionheart meets Joan of Arc meets Emperor Augustus. He is the man.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're thinking that his story up until now, whilst being quite battly, isn't that out of the ordinary? Well, there is a lot more to come when we go through the life and deeds of Birger Magnusson, Birger Jarl, next time.
Yes, and that is for next time, and we're done for today. When we return, we'll see how King Erik finally settles the dispute with the Folkungs with a lot of help from his new Jarl, Birger Jarl, and see what plans Erik has for Sweden after military defeating his only pretender and challenger to the title of king. And it's going to be a lot of fun.
It will indeed, but that is enough from us for this week. Remember to get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or email if you have any thoughts, comments, or suggestions. And if you've been listening to our intelligent speech talk that we put up and you have any questions, please do send them as well. As originally there was a Q&A section after that talk, but we don't have that bit of the recording. So if you want to now get in on that and have any questions, then feel free to send them to us.
Yep, but that's it for now, and we'll see you next time.
Hej då!
Bye bye.